Well, we have been following the journeys of the Apostle Paul for the last few weeks. Paul went on 3 missionary journeys. Last week, we looked at some of the things that happened on his second trip. But today, we are skipping ahead to a journey that Paul has been looking forward to for quite some time. And that is his journey to Rome. It's been Paul's desire for a long time now to go to Rome. And in the context of the book of Acts, Rome is the place that represents the ends of the earth, okay? If you remember, we read about that when we were in chapter 1 of Acts. The gospel, of course, will be preached in the whole earth, and then the end will come, as Jesus tells us in Matthew 24. But in the context of these stories that we're looking at in the book of Acts, Rome represents the progress of the gospel in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and now the ends of the earth. And one of the things you'll notice right out of the gate here this morning is that taking the gospel to the ends of the earth is not an easy task, okay? In fact, it's quite costly. The journey that we're about to take a look at this morning was not an easy one. And it took a long time for Paul to get to where he's going, which is why it's going to take us 2 weeks to look at this whole story. And what we're going to look at or see as we look at this story together is that despite how difficult the journey is, God is with Paul every step of the way. Despite all of the challenges and all of the setbacks and the life-threatening situations that he finds himself in, Paul conducts himself with a quiet confidence that can only come from his unshakable faith in a sovereign God. And so as we go through this chapter this morning, what we're going to get is a glimpse into Paul's theology. Now, not the same way that we would get it in Romans or Galatians or in places like that where Paul systematically goes through the scriptures and reasons with us and lays out for us the foundations and doctrines of the faith. But what we get here in Acts 27 is theology on a practical level. Okay, theology in the trenches, where your belief in things like the sovereignty of God really gets put to the test. Because, see, there's what we think we believe about God, and then there's what we really believe about God. There's what we sing about and pray about on a Sunday morning, and then there's what we actually do during the rest of the week. And if we're honest with ourselves, sometimes those two things don't always line up. What we believe about God and what we practice. And at which point we typically blame our behavior on circumstances or stress at work or those people who know how to push our buttons, when in reality, the only button that's really getting pushed is our theology. Okay, what is it that we really believe about God? Do we really believe that he is both sovereign and good? Do we trust him with our lives? Do we believe that he is trustworthy? And are we surrendered to his will? Now, we may say that we are and sing that we are, but do we really believe it? And there's nothing like a good old nor'easter when you're out on a ship in the middle of the sea to find out what it is that you really believe. And with Paul, what we're going to find out this morning is that this guy is as solid as they come. What Paul says about God as he's writing letters to churches is the same thing that he believes about God when he's on a ship in the middle of the storm. In other words, Paul's theology works. It's not something that's only useful in a book or in a letter or on a sermon on a Sunday. Paul's theology is practical, and it's useful in everyday situations. See, there's nothing, quote, spiritual about going from point A to point B. Like that's something that people do all of the time. And yet, what we're going to see this morning is how one man's theology plays a huge part in a very stressful journey. Luke, the writer of Acts, provides us with a very detailed account of what happens when a ship full of all kinds of people, prisoners and soldiers and merchants and sailors, gets caught in a storm that threatens their very lives. And Paul's theology, what Paul believes about God, gets put to the test. And so that is where we're headed this morning. But first, let's bring us up to speed. Last week, we found Paul in the city of Athens, okay, after which, when his team finally catches up with him, they then move on to the city of Corinth and then to Ephesus to preach and plant churches in those cities. And then on Paul's third missionary journey, he is able to go back to those churches to encourage them and to strengthen them, and also to collect an offering from them to help bring some much needed help and relief to the church in Jerusalem. And so Paul then personally delivers that offering to the church, where he is arrested in Jerusalem by the Romans. And then after a series of events, Paul appeals his case to Caesar, which is his right as a Roman citizen. At which point, King Agrippa, who heard Paul's defense, says this about Paul at the end of chapter 26. He says, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." But see, freedom wasn't Paul's goal. Taking the gospel to Rome is what Paul really wants. And now he's on his way. Maybe not under the circumstances that he had envisioned, but nevertheless, Paul is on his way to Rome. And that's where we pick up the story in chapter 27 and verse 1. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. Now notice the pronoun we that's being used here. Okay, Luke, as we mentioned, is the writer of the book of Acts. And so whenever we see the word we know that Luke isn't just writing the story, he's part of the story. Okay, and so everything we're going to read from here on out is written from Luke's personal experience of the events that took place. And the reason I bring that up is because a lot of times the Bible gets attacked for not being historically reliable. But see, the truth is those attacks are often based on personal prejudice against the scriptures and not on the facts. Because the fact is, there is no other author in history that has been more scrutinized than Luke has. And every time he's put to the test, the critics are put to shame. Either that or they're converted. And Acts 27 is just a great, great example of this. There's a book that's out of print now, but I found a digital copy of called The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. It was written about 150 years ago by a man by the name of James Smith, who was both a sailor and a scholar. And in that book, this is a man who had personal experience of what it was like to sail the Mediterranean Sea. And so there's a section in his book where he says this. He says, "No man who is not a sailor could have written of a sea voyage so consistent in all of its parts unless it was from actual observation." Okay, and what you'll see as we read this story this morning, you'll see this detail that Luke gives, which is a testament to the accuracy of the book. Now, you might be wondering, is all this detail really necessary when it comes to writing about the gospel? Did Luke really have to write about ports and anchors and gears and bows and sterns? Is all of this information useful when it comes to writing about the gospel? Well, it's useful because it actually happened. Okay, see, a lot of people look at a passage like this and say, well, it's only useful from a gospel perspective if we can turn it into a metaphor, right? And so the ship becomes our life, and the storm becomes the trials that we face in life, and then the anchors represent one thing, and the sails represent another, and before you know it, you're giving people some really good advice about life, but you've missed the whole point of the story. Okay, Luke's point in chapter 27 is not to write a metaphor about life. His point is to give a detailed account of what he saw take place on a real ship in a real storm and how the Apostle Paul, a very real guy, responded under those circumstances. So keep that in mind as we look at this morning. This is a voyage that actually took place, and Luke was there to document it. Now, Luke was probably there as Paul's personal physician, in addition to this guy named Aristarchus, who we're told was from Thessalonica, and who Paul mentions in Colossians chapter 4 as his fellow prisoner. Now, there's no indication that Aristarchus was on this ship against his will. So what Paul is probably saying is, here's a guy who gave up his freedom in order to come with me and care for my needs. And so the point is, Paul doesn't embark on this journey on his own, but he has a couple of really good friends who are willing to travel with him. In fact, he meets up with some more friends the very next day. Look at verse 3. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. So notice what's happening here. Paul has these friends that he's traveling with who are caring for his needs, and now, after only 24 hours, he's visiting with some more friends, and for what purpose? To care for his needs, right? To take care of him. And it's important that we don't miss this, because in just a few minutes, we're going to see Paul in the midst of a very dangerous situation where he comes out looking like a superhero, okay? But Paul is no superhero. He's just a regular guy. He's a real guy with real needs who fortunately has some very real friends who are in the right place at the right time. And just a little side note to point out how cool God is, because I like to do that when I get the chance. There's a city, okay, so this city in Sidon, it's about 80 miles north of Jerusalem. Now, why are there Christians in Sidon? Well, because back in Acts chapter 8, a guy by the name of Saul, now Paul, launched a full-scale attack against the Christians in Jerusalem and scattered them throughout Judea and Samaria to places like Sidon, and now those very same Christians are there to take care of Paul. In Paul's letter to the Romans, which we're studying on Tuesday nights, Paul says in chapter 8 of that letter that for those who love God, all things work together for good when we're called according to his purpose. And this here is a perfect example of that. Even when Paul was opposing Jesus, he was still serving his purposes. And now we see Paul personally benefiting from that. I'm sure that thought must have crossed his mind when he was being cared for by these guys in Sidon. Continuing with the story, verse 4. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty at Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go farther, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Okay, so lots of cities and ports mentioned here, which probably mean about as much to you as they did to me when I first read them. Okay, so let's put a map up to give you a better idea what it is that's taking place here. Okay, we got a map of this? Great. So down here in the bottom right corner is Caesarea, where Paul got started, and he left that port on a coastal vessel, which is exactly what it sounds like. This is a boat that's built to sail along the coast. And so the first trip that they took from Caesarea to Sidon went really well, turned out just fine. But when they left Sidon, the winds were against them, and as you can see, started to push them away from the coast and out into the open sea, which is not a good thing if you're on a ship that's built for the coast. You're in danger of capsizing out there. But fortunately, you can see they made it all the way to Myra, which is at the top of the screen there. And at that point, they transferred to a larger ship, a cargo ship that was bound for Italy. But even with a bigger ship, they had trouble navigating. It was slow going for a number of days. In fact, it was so bad, they had to change course and head south down toward the Isle of Crete over there on the left. But they must have catched too much wind or the wrong kind of wind, because it took them, as you can see, south under the island of Crete, which is not a good thing if you're trying to sail north to Italy. And so they anchored at the first port they could find on that island, which is all the way off to the edge of the screen there, called Fair Havens. But don't let the name fool you, okay? This was not a pleasant place to spend the winter, which brings us to verse 9. Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over. The fast refers to the Day of Atonement, which means this would have been in October, which is important to keep in mind because everybody knew back then you do not sail a ship in October. The weather is not good for that, which is why Paul advised them saying, I think we got the verses for this, right? Yeah. Paul advised them saying, sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. Now, I think it's important to point out that Paul's not prophesying here, okay? If he was, he would have been wrong because there is no loss of life on this trip. Everyone ends up making it. So sorry if I ruined it for you, okay? But Paul's not saying these things because God spoke to him. Instead, he's speaking from experience. In fact, that word perceive in the Greek means to understand by experience. So what experience is Paul talking about? Well, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul says this, 3 times I was shipwrecked, and a night and a day I was adrift at sea. And Paul wrote those words before all of this happened. So Paul knows a thing or two about shipwrecks, right? He's been in 3 of them already. But the centurion, verse 11, paid more attention to the pilot and the owner of the ship than he did to Paul, which he will eventually regret. Verse 12. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. Now that's encouraging, isn't it? The majority decided to take a chance that somehow they might make it. Okay, verse 13. Now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete close to the shore. Okay, so check this out on the map. It's only 40 miles from Fair Havens to Phoenix, okay? Down there at the bottom. It's only 40 miles from Fair Havens to Phoenix. That's like a 1 day's journey by sea. And the passengers and the crew, they woke up that morning to a warm, gentle, breeze that was perfect for a short jaunt across the coast to a pleasant harbor where they can spend the winter. Sounds great, right? Well, you've heard too good to be true, right? Verse 14, but soon a tempestuous wind called a nor'easter struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis was a sandbar just off the coast of North Africa that was well known for sinking ships. Okay, so fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. So now they're just throwing stuff overboard. And on the 3rd day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Okay, so take a look again here at where they are on the map. Okay, so yeah, not good, right? Not good. So one moment you're enjoying a nice, warm, gentle breeze and being carried to an island paradise, and the next thing you know, you're in the middle of a nor'easter, fighting for your life, and things are so bad you've literally abandoned all hope of being saved. Now, I said I wasn't going to turn this story into a metaphor, but isn't this life? I mean, everything's going great. Everything is smooth sailing when all of a sudden, bam, right? You find yourself right smack in the middle of the storm and your whole life turns upside down. Whether it's an unexpected illness or the loss of a job or a crisis in a relationship, most of the time when a storm hits, we don't see it coming, right? Most of the time, we are caught off guard. We're just carrying on with life as usual, and the next thing you know, you've given up hope. But see, this is not a metaphor. This really happened. Things got bad, and they're about to get worse. But in the middle of the storm, when all hope is lost, Paul stands up to speak. Verse 21. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss." Now, it sounds like Paul's saying, "I told you so," right? Doesn't it? But I don't really think he is. I don't think he's trying to rub it in. He's just wanting to make sure that they're really listening to him now, because he has some very important things that he needs to say. Verse 22, "Yet now I urge you, take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship, and he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island.'" So good news is nobody's going to die. Bad news, we're still going to crash, right? So definitely better than what they thought was going to happen, but this is still not an easy situation. And this is how it is sometimes. You go through life, you go through something that's difficult, and then all of a sudden, God's faithful, he speaks, he gives you hope. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the difficulties are automatically over, right? Or that the suffering is going to end anytime soon, or that it isn't going to get worse before it gets better, which is how it was for these guys, as we see here in verse 27. When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat from the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, so these are sailors pretending to help, right? These guys are acting like they're risking their lives for everyone on the ship, when in reality, they're just a bunch of cowards trying to get in a lifeboat and escape. And so Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's lifeboat and let it go. Now, do you see what's happening here? I mean, all of a sudden, everybody is listening to Paul, okay? He's a prisoner on this ship. And now he's running the ship. I can just picture him standing up there on the bow with the rain coming down and the seawater splashing in his face, barking out orders, right? And here we have these soldiers cutting away the ropes to the lifeboat, all because Paul is telling them to do it. Now, we already know that Paul is no superhero. We already established that this morning. And so we're going to see in just a moment why he is able to display such confidence in the middle of this life-threatening situation. But let's finish the story first. Here in verse 33, it says, "As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, 'Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength. For not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you.' And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. And they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea." Now, I just want to pause here for a moment and point out something that I think is worth emphasizing. Even though Paul is a, quote, spiritual man who prays to God and hears from God, that doesn't mean that he's oblivious to everything that's happening around him. Right? In other words, even though Paul has faith that everyone is going to survive this ordeal because God told him so, That doesn't mean that he's just going to ignore the practical needs that are right in front of him. I mean, these guys haven't eaten for 2 weeks. Okay, they need to eat, and so Paul takes care of that, and he does it. He provides for them in that way by providing for them the food that they need, and he does it in a way that glorifies God as he breaks the bread and he gives thanks in front of them all. And the result is they were encouraged, right? They had hope, not just because of what Paul said, but because of what Paul did. Verse 39. Now, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. And the next week, we'll see what happens when they get there, okay? You like snakes? Okay, well, you got a week to prepare. Okay, in the meantime, before we end this morning, I just want to take a moment and answer one question, okay? What is it that gave Paul such confidence in the middle of this storm? Remember, this isn't a metaphor. This is a real story. And Paul isn't a superhero. He's just a regular guy. And I think when we allegorize a story like this or make Paul out to be some kind of otherworldly character who's nothing at all like us, we miss the whole point of the story. Luke goes out of his way here to emphasize the reality of what took place, going into incredible detail so we can literally hear the storm ripping through the sky and see the ship breaking up under our feet and smell the fear that was present among the people on board. And then contrast that with what was going on with the Apostle Paul, who stepped up when no one else would, who took leadership when others cowered in fear, and who brought hope when everyone else had lost it. What did Paul have that everyone else didn't? I think the simple answer is faith, right? But faith in what? Well, faith in God. Okay. But faith in God that what? Faith in God that he can stop the storm? Faith in God that he can calm the seas? Faith that he can hold the ship together and keep it from splitting apart? Faith in God that what? See, Paul had faith in God. There's no doubt about that. But what exactly did he believe? What was Paul's theology? In other words, what did he believe about God, especially in this situation, that gave him the confidence to take action when no one else could? Well, I think we get some insight into that immediately after the storm hits, and everyone else has given up hope. And it's in that moment that Paul finally speaks. Listen again to what he said in verse 23. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong. Now notice he doesn't say to the God who is the maker of the heavens and the earth, or the God who can control the wind and the waves, or the God who sees all things and knows all things, but the God to whom I belong and to whom I worship, who I serve, right? Which pretty much goes without saying if you belong to him. Right? If God is my master and I belong to him, then my life's purpose, by definition, is to serve him. And although Paul does say right before this that there will be no loss of life but only the ship, right? I don't think that's what gave Paul the confidence that he needed. It probably gave the others confidence, or at least a little hope, but not Paul. Remember, for Paul, to live is Christ and to die is gain. So, he's got nothing to lose. In fact, the truth is, God only spares Paul's life here so he can die later in Rome. So, this isn't about self-preservation. This is about something else. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul alludes to that something else. When he explains his theology to the believers at that church in this way, he says, "You're not your own, but you were bought with a price." Now, in that context, Paul is talking about glorifying God in our bodies, but the point is the same. We glorify God with our lives because our lives aren't our own anymore. They've been bought and paid for by the blood of Jesus. And so I need to stop thinking in terms of self-preservation and start thinking in terms of, how do I live my life? How does my life and the situations in my life and the opportunities in my life, how do they bring glory to God? That's what gave Paul confidence in this very stressful situation. He knew who he belonged to. Okay? Paul may have been a prisoner, but he didn't belong to Caesar. He may have been a passenger on this ship, but he didn't belong to the captain. Paul belonged to Jesus. And that's true not just for Paul, but for everyone who is a follower of Jesus. Your life is not your own. My life is not my own. It belongs to Jesus. And there's a freedom that comes and a confidence that comes from walking in the light of that truth. But it's not always easy, right? Especially when we're faced with circumstances and situations that are out of our control. But it's in those moments that we finally discover what it is that we truly believe and who it is that we truly belong to. Amen.